Practical, the Political, the Ethical seminar series at the Institute of Philosophy at the University of London, organized by Kate Friedenberg and myself. We are absolutely delighted to have with us today Vida Yao of Rice University, speaking with us about the snares of self-hatred. Just to let everybody know, we're going to record the talk to post on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be recorded, just make sure not to say anything during the talk, which should be easy. Please keep yourself muted for the duration of the talk. After the talk, we'll take a 5-minute break. And after that, we will have about an hour for Q&A. So take it away, Vida.
All right, thank you so much, Jonathan and Kate, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here today. So there is a handout. I plan to read a written version of the paper, and so there's just the basic structure on the handout. There's some kind of arbitrarily selected quotes, and then there's a bunch of citations, and those appear in the various versions of the written version, and that's really more to just give you a sense of some of the people that I'm drawing on, where that might not be explicit in the version that I'm going to read. So thank you all for being here. It's really wonderful to see you all and seeing some familiar faces. All right, so I'll begin. In imagining self-hatred, we see a person turned in on herself. Her suffering seems driven by two seemingly antagonistic, but nonetheless complementary forces. From one angle, we see a repeated pattern of self-directed hostility. From another, we see, curiously, a receptivity to that hostility. Unimpeded, these movements form a cyclical and dynamic progression, difficult to resolve or subdue. Hatred of oneself tends to nourish and perpetuate itself. The person who suffers it coils inward, spiraling further and further out of reach. As with certain other self-reflexive emotions, such as guilt and shame, our understanding of self-hatred may be aided by views of the mind, which posit an internalized other whose perspective on oneself embodies and focuses a set of concerns and values, and whose perspective one is in some sense vulnerable to. To feel guilt for some transgression is not solely to feel the anger that one would feel toward another's trespasses, now directed back onto oneself as an object of that anger. It is at the same time to have a certain reaction to that anger, perhaps, for example, to accept it as deserved, or to even welcome the lashing of one's bad conscience. To feel shame before oneself is not just to see oneself in some compromising way, it is to feel compromised by one's own gaze. Likewise, the person who hates herself does not feel the hatred she might have for another simply taking herself as object of that attitude. She is not merely the seat of an internalized hostile voice and perspective that she may, for example, react to with indifference. She does not only tell herself that she is worthless, but will typically feel herself so in response. And her suffering may not just result from pain that she is inclined to inflict, but suffering that in some sense she is inclined to suffer. But how is this so? How in self-hatred does one become not only subject to, but vulnerable and even receptive to one's own hostility? One account of self-hatred that has been inherited, at least by our culture, if not by contemporary philosophers and psychologists, finds its sources in Freud. That self-hatred can impede one's hopes for happiness is obvious. What is less obvious, according to Freud, is that it is the price we pay for developing a superego and thereby a moral conscience at all. On this picture, the self-hating man is relentlessly cruel and abusive to himself, seeks out forms of self-punishment and self-sabotage, castigates himself for actions he has not in fact performed, and may even, as a pale criminal, act in ways that affirm the persecutory stance of his own psyche. This is because he is, though likely unaware of it, racked with feelings of guilt. Guilt, which is in part a response to motives and impulses that he may be able to conceal from others, but which, upon developing a superego, he cannot conceal from himself. But Freud also sought to explain why one's hostility toward oneself will tend to be disproportionate or seemingly wholly indifferent to whether or not one has in fact done, intended, or merely entertained the thought of doing something that would warrant feelings of guilt. This is because, he suggests, the superego does not only serve as a seat of moral conscience, quote, keeping a watch over the actions and intentions of the ego and judging them, exercising a censorship. It also redirects the energy of a set of hostile, aggressive, and destructive impulses that are part of our shared natural endowment. One's mind must find release of this aggressive energy somewhere, and so this explanation goes. One's superego redirects it back onto oneself, channeling this aggression through pangs of bad conscience. We arrive at a proposal that thus promises not only to explain how and why self-hatred arises, but why it may be so ubiquitous and why it can be so persistent. But suppose we take this seriously, the seeming sources of self-hatred as genuine. What people seem to hate themselves for, again, does not seem limited to those things that would give rise to feelings of guilt. This will include non-moral characteristics of oneself, including much that one could not be in any sound sense morally responsible for. Of course, one might insist that guilt is pernicious in just this way. It captures and holds in distortive construal a wide range of things that one would not, if only one were perhaps more clear-headed or well-disposed, feel guilty about. Survivor's guilt and the guilt commonly experienced by victims of sexual assault, for example, may testify to this. But we might also consider that self-hatred, after all, may take different forms, and that at least one form would itself be distorted by thinking of it as a manifestation of guilt, even confusedly or pathologically experienced. We might also consider that while it may be a condition we become liable to upon living within social conditions, that the social conditions that may give rise to it are more contingent than Freud allows. To illustrate the kind of self-hatred I have in mind, consider an example from James Baldwin's 1964 Another Country. At the center of this novel is the unraveling and eventual self-destruction of Rufus Scott, a young Black man living in New York in the late 1950s. Once self-assured and full of life, we are introduced to a man who is a ghost of his former self. It is a lingering mystery to Rufus and his friends and family what has happened. While it is suggested after his death that Rufus was racked with guilt he felt in response to his brutal and violent treatment of his lover, Leona, a white woman from Georgia, this explanation, offered by a character who admits that he never cared much for Rufus anyway, strikes us both unimaginative and incomplete. There seems to have been some other force at work here, some other explanation for Rufus's self-hatred, one which explains why he acted as he did, like a bastard, he bitterly suggests. And so in turn, his subsequent guilt for his subsequent mistreatment of Leona. There are two other aspects of Rufus's self-hatred worth pausing on. The first is the quality of his suffering that does not consist simply in hostility toward himself. In response to his own hostility, he feels diminished, hopeless, and alone. He experiences a kind of psychic pain and anguish that he comes to believe will only be alleviated should he no longer exist at all. Having been missing for 6 weeks, Rufus turns up at his friend Vivaldo's apartment. And here is Baldwin. Perhaps now, though, he had hit bottom. One thing about bottom, he told himself, you can't fall any farther. He tried to take comfort from this thought. Yet there knocked in his heart the suspicion that the bottom did not really exist. Vivaldo was close to him, stroking his head. The stuff of Vivaldo's sweater stifled him. He wanted to stop crying, stand up, breathe, but he could only sit there with his face in his hands. Vivaldo murmured, "Go ahead, baby, let it out. Let it all out." He wanted to stand up, breathe, and at the same time, he wanted to lie flat on the floor and to be swallowed into whatever would stop this pain. Yet he was aware, perhaps for the first time in his life, that nothing would stop it. Nothing. This was himself. The second aspect is that Rufus's self-hatred persists in spite of the love of both Leona as well as of Vivaldo. It is repeatedly stressed that he loves them both and they love him, but their reassurances are drowned out by his own self-loathing. The hostility he feels toward himself is too persistent or powerful to be in any way lessened or diminished by their love. Their attempts to express their love for him only seem to exacerbate his hostility, both toward himself and toward them. Again, the central question I am interested in here, roughly stated, is how self-hatred manifests not only in hostility toward oneself, but in a certain kind of vulnerability to that hostility. How someone becomes, as Rufus becomes, a victim of one's own venom. But because it isn't obvious that these two components of self-hatred could be understood as operating independently of one another, I will begin by framing this investigation in light of another question that has arisen from contemporary philosophical engagement with Freud's views, a question that gives rise to what I will refer to as the problem of authority. David Velleman, John Day, Samuel Scheffler, and more recently Beatrice Longinus have remarked on several striking parallels between Kant's view of moral motivation and Freud's discussion of the superego. And Freud himself suggests that the superego just is the Kantian moral law within us. For Kantians, this is of significance because Freud's account of the superego seems to be a promising and perhaps naturalized account of the Kantian conception of moral conscience and a Kantian conception of guilt. The superego bears the strictness and disciplinary qualities of this ideal. As a part of a more general moral psychological view, Freud's proposal also seems to capture the idea that to violate a moral law one acts in disobedience to some governing authority within oneself, and typically because of some motive of self-gratification. And importantly, in developing a superego, a person becomes disposed to subject himself to feelings of bad conscience, which arise independently of concerns about having his transgressions witnessed or punished by actual others, a necessary condition for possessing a recognizably moral conscience at all. But the problem of authority arises once we see that the mere internalization of an aggressive figure cannot adequately account for the disposition to feel guilt, should we understand this emotion as also necessarily a direct response to a perceived violation of one's moral obligations, rather than as a kind of anxiety one feels in response to being punished for that violation. In a canonical piece of analytic philosophical engagement with Freudian psychology, David H. Jones argues that Freud does not adequately distinguish between refraining from violating a moral duty because one fears the hostility of one's superego, from refraining because one fears an external threat from an actual other. Thus, Jones concludes, Freud's views cannot accommodate genuine moral motivation nor a proper conception of guilt. The problem, Velleman argues, is that Freud does not give a plausible account of how the ego views the superego, so that it is seen as a source of morally authoritative demands and punishments, rather than a source of demands the subject might simply take a, quote, dismissive or defiant attitude toward, and threats he might simply fear, quote, despite issuing from a part of himself. We must account for how the ego, as Velleman puts it, buys into the superego's demands. According to Velleman's reconstruction of Freud, the ego buys into the superego's demands when it views the superego not just as an internalized source of demands and threats, but also as an ideal figure that it both loves and strives to emulate. But one might object that a fear of, for example, the loss of the love of an internalized figure is just like the fear of that figure's anger, not yet to motivate action out of respect for that figure's moral authority. So furthermore, Velleman attributes to the ego a capacity for normative judgment exercised when the subject reflects on what ideals she ought to have. While her ego ideal is originally shaped around her parental figures, as she develops and matures as an autonomous moral agent, she must determine for herself what the content of this ideal should really be, thereby coming to act under laws or according to demands or ideals that she has given to herself. My concern here is not with whether the problem of authority is successfully met by Velleman's proposal, or indeed even whether it should be. One might think, after all, that guilt lies somewhere in between the crudest fears of being caught and punished and a response felt in violation of a law that one has given to oneself. Nonetheless, it provides a path forward in considering what I can now label, in contrast, the problem of vulnerability. First, as with the problem of authority, the problem of vulnerability arises in the course of attempting to understand a particular emotion, in this case, self-hatred, that because of its self-reflexive nature may be illuminated through the positing of an internalized other, whose hostile perspective on oneself characterizes and partly constitutes the emotion in question. Second, as I'll argue, the problem of vulnerability also arises once we see that the mere internalization of some hostile figure is not sufficient to account for self-hatred, given that one is also in some sense vulnerable to that figure's hostile perspective. So third, the solution will involve positing a way in which the ego views or relates to the internalized other, so that the subject experiences that hostility in a way that will account for the vulnerability one experiences in self-hatred. And in particular, the solution I will offer, like Velleman's proposed solution to the problem of authority, will involve the ego viewing and experiencing the internalized other as an object of a certain kind of interpersonal love. In order to see why near internalization of a hostile figure is not sufficient to account for self-hatred, we must also see what kind of vulnerability we are attempting to account for. One might propose that if we could account for the vulnerability and receptivity to one's own hostility that one experiences in guilt, we will, a fortiori, be able to account for these features of self-hatred, assuming, as Freud suggests, that self-hatred just is a manifestation of guilt. But as suggested, this proposal seems incomplete. Again, most notably, self-hatred can stem not from a concern about what one has done or is inclined to do, but rather is in response to qualities or traits that one believes oneself to possess. And while one might hate oneself for traits one believes best explain why one has acted or is disposed to act in morally wrong ways, feeling what Jean Hampton calls moral hatred for oneself, it is just as familiar that one can hate oneself because of one's looks, one's lack of talent, or membership in a class or group of people, and not because one implicitly believes that one has a duty or obligation, perhaps a self-regarding duty, not to possess these qualities, or that one is morally responsible for having such qualities in the first place. The sources of self-hatred are wide in kind, particular to the person, and not reducible to considerations of what one perceives oneself obligated to eliminate or alter. In these respects, the sources of self-hatred resemble the sources of shame. A further distinction between the vulnerability one experiences in guilt and the vulnerability that one experiences in self-hatred can be drawn if we were to also assume that in order to feel guilt, perhaps of the kind that motivates the problem of authority, one must have acted in violation of a law that one has established for oneself autonomously. But self-hatred is often, interestingly, and for some frustratingly, heteronymous. Imagine, for example, a woman who has spent her life understanding and rejecting traditionally feminine norms of behavior and appearance for good reasons, but who nonetheless begins to hate herself for her thinning hair and sagging skin. We can also characterize the different respects in which one is vulnerable to the hostility of an internalized perspective on oneself. In coming to hate oneself, one views one's hostile internalized other as possessing what I will call epistemic, definitional, and evaluative credibility about oneself. Imagine, for example, a man who has come to hate himself for his lack of ambition. First, in hating himself, he accepts this descriptive aspect of this self-assessment. Second, he does not simply hate his lack of ambition, understood as just one of his traits among others. He hates himself for his lack of ambition. And so he accepts too that this quality defines him, that his lack of ambition is of some central significance to who he is. Hatred of oneself mirrors hatred of others in this respect. It tends to both globalize certain traits as defining the hated person and presents those traits as essential to the hated person's identity. And third, along with accepting this negative assessment of himself, he does not just view his lack of ambition as one more fact about himself that he can accept dispassionately, with equanimity or good humor. He is wounded by this assessment of himself. His emotional response evidence that his being an unambitious person has a certain kind of evaluative significance for him. What that evaluative significance is what is under investigation here. But we can begin by noticing that the vulnerability I am focused on here is of the kind that we experience in light of the perceptions and judgments of other human beings, a respect in which we are not vulnerable to, for example, natural disasters or disease, even when such things frustrate our ends or ravage our bodies. As discussed by P.F. Strawson, in being wronged by another, what we object to is not solely or sometimes centrally the material injury or harm that the action has brought about. We object to what the action suggests about how we are being viewed by the wrongdoer and what we believe or fear it suggests about ourselves. Hence our emotional reaction of resentment when we can presume that they, given what they have done, regard us without due respect or goodwill. As Geoffrey Murphy has put this point, most of us tend to care about what others, at least some others, some significant group whose good opinion we value, think about us, how much they think we matter. Our self-respect is social in at least this sense, and it is simply part of the human condition that we are weak and vulnerable in these ways. But the weakness and vulnerability one experiences in self-hatred is in one respect narrower and another respect broader than the kind that Strawson identifies and that Murphy and others have elaborated on. As Murphy's remark suggests, we are not in fact vulnerable to the views of any hostile human being. There are actual human beings who may be hostile toward us, who view us in negative ways, and who may express their hostility and negativity in cruel and aggressive manners. but to whom we may react with dispassionate, reciprocated hostility, management, or indifference. Consider, for example, Bernard Williams' discussion of Ajax's shame and suicide after his delusional slaughter of a flock of sheep. Here's Williams. Ajax could not go on living. It was in virtue of the relations between what he expected of the world and what the world expects of a man who expects that of it. The world there is represented in him by an internalized other, and it is not merely any other. He would be as unimpressed by the contempt of some people as he would be led by the reassurances of others. Okay. Given that we are not emotionally vulnerable to the hostility of any other human perspective on ourselves, mere internalization of a hostile perspective is not enough to secure the kind of vulnerability to ourselves we experience in self-hatred. I might react to this internalized perspective just as I react to actual others whose views I am, as Williams puts it, unimpressed by. And we can spell out this lack of vulnerability along the lines I described above. I might not grant this voice epistemic credibility, disbelieving or easily dismissing what it says. For example, that I'm a terrible singer, or that I'm overly cynical, or that I am too easy to please or eager to please, as simply inaccurate. Or I might feel hatred for these qualities, but experience this in a localized rather than a globalized manner, hating some aspect of myself without hating myself in light of that aspect, because I do not accept that this is something which defines who I am. Or I may even accept that I possess a certain trait or quality that and that it defines me, but not experience this as having the kind of evaluative significance that seems necessary to experience both sides of self-hatred. It may not matter in the relevant kind of way for me to feel wounded or diminished given my acceptance of this defining self-assessment. Second, while Strawson tends to emphasize attitudes that we can reasonably expect from one another, a modicum of goodwill, for example, our hopes for how some people will view us will not be limited to what we can reasonably demand or expect from them. Just as we can be wounded, hurt, and diminished by how certain others see us without presupposing that we can expect or demand of them to see us any differently, the self-hating person's vulnerability to his own hostility is not one that presupposes an expectation that he be seen by himself in certain ways rather than others, and is not expressed in resentment toward his own hostile perspective's lack of respect, but again, in feelings of diminishment and anguish. A person who is able to convince himself that he doesn't deserve his own hostility and is thereby able to emotionally bolster himself against his own criticisms is already on his way to shoring up the lack of vulnerability that one may need to mitigate one's self-loathing. Here then is a restatement of the puzzle of vulnerability. In self-hatred, how does one view one's internalized other so that one experiences this figure as having epistemic, definitional, and evaluative credibility, where that evaluative credibility is evinced by a person suffering from feelings of, for example, diminishment and anguish in response to that hostility? When one buys into the hostile perspective that one has on oneself, what kind of significance has that perspective been invested with? As I suggested, the answer to the problem of vulnerability I will propose stems from one more similarity it shares with the problem of authority. Their answers will both rely on another basic attitude to explain how the emotion under investigation develops, our love of others. On Freud's picture of the emergence of guilt, it is our love of our parents, understood in its most rudimentary form as a love for them given their responsiveness to our physiological needs, paired with our hostility toward them, that results in the emotional ambivalence that must be resolved through the development of the superego and thereby the disposition to feel guilt. For Velleman's Freud, the superego gains its authority over the ego partly through the love that one has for one's parental figures, which explains why the ego's first ego ideals, which is why they explain why they become the ego's first ego ideals. A form of love that also develops from a recognition of their ability to respond to one's physiological neediness, but which Velleman argues is fundamentally responsive to their humanity in the Kantian sense. Following this lead, my answer to the problem of vulnerability will begin by first considering how, in what respects, we are vulnerable in general to our loved ones. And upon isolating a particular kind of vulnerability to our loved ones that I will discuss here, one that arises from a kind of neediness for them, not reducible to our physiological neediness, we will be able to see why we are both vulnerable to ourselves in self-hatred, as well as why we are vulnerable in the ways that I have described. Interpersonal love is sufficient to render us emotionally vulnerable to others, as well as susceptible to certain forms of hostility and pain. There are a number of different ways in which philosophers have characterized these familiar aspects of love. As Harry Frankfurt suggests, to love another is to will her well-being for her sake and to experience her well-being as an extension of one's own. Thus, one is liable to suffer when she suffers. As Martha Nussbaum emphasizes, to love another human being is to love a finite, vulnerable, and fundamentally mortal being. Grief, we might think, is a necessary development of that love. As Monique Wonderly has recently discussed, developing the psychological views of John Bowlby, certain forms of love manifest themselves in attachments to our loved ones, and thus we are left feeling less competent and confident in our agency when we are separated from them. And of course, we tend to empathize, sympathize, and even sometimes emotionally identify with our loved ones. Here I want to isolate one more way in which we are vulnerable to our loved ones. Begin with an observation of Herbert Morris's. In a discussion of the various forms of suffering one may experience in feeling guilty, he discusses a case in which one wrongs not just a person who is a member of one's moral community, but who is also a person one loves. Alongside the pain of guilt and the pains of empathy, sympathy, emotional identification, and the pain of separation, Morris describes a distinctive kind of pain that one may feel in recognition that one is responsible for the dissolution of a union that one was once party to. As he writes, to be cut off from what we love is intensely painful, but there is more involved, for in union best exemplified in love, there is an intensely satisfying feeling of wholeness or completeness. In cutting oneself off from the loved one comes to see oneself as being cut off, not whole, as if one had destroyed what one loved and thus also destroyed a part of oneself. What may explain this intensely satisfying feeling of wholeness or completeness in union with a loved one? Why, in losing the union or the relationship necessary to sustain it, might one feel as though one has also destroyed a part of oneself? These experiences can be captured and explained should we take seriously the idea that not only do our self-respect and dignity depend on the attitudes of at least some others, but that as philosophers who have argued that the self is essentially relational have discussed, our identities too are so vulnerable. The attitudes of our loved ones in particular play a central role in the formation and maintenance of our identities. Developmentally, it is within the context of intimate interpersonal relationships that one receives the kind of interaction that will form one's most basic sense of self. One learns that one is an agent and that one has needs that need to be met, etc., through being recognized and responded to as an agent with such needs by one's early caregivers. And it is also with intimate relationships that we continue to develop, discover, and maintain who we are. As one's self-conceptions become richer and more developed in tandem with and in response to the conceptions that others have of oneself. One both becomes and discovers what kind of sister one is, for example, in relation to one's siblings and their conceptions of what kind of sister one is. Moreover, the kind of first personal authority that we sometimes have in defining our self-conception, that is, those qualities that we take to be central or essential to who we are, is one that we sometimes share, and in particular, we share it with our intimates. And finally, it is within certain loving, intimate relationships that one can sometimes experience the kind of attention that can discover, reveal, and partly constitute one's identity and personality. This attention, when provided by a loved one, will ideally partly crystallize and constitute our identities in ways that are consistent with our flourishing more generally. As Amelie Rorty writes of this relationship between love and attention, when the lover's attentions are active in forming and crystallizing the beloved's personality, the lover is also careful to attend to the real structure of that personality, not foisting or projecting an identity that, by becoming constitutive, will so conflict with the rest of the beloved's character that the person cannot flourish. We do indeed help to create those whom we love, but we do not do it from whole cloth. Now, because of the roles that our loved ones play in discovering, forming, and maintaining our identities, we can come to experience their perspectives on us as possessing the epistemic, definitional, and evaluative credibility that I described above. Most straightforwardly, we may acknowledge that our loved ones know us best. They tend to be the people we experience as sometimes having definitional authority over ourselves, an authority that is typically reserved for us alone. They may attend to us in ways that can both reveal and crystallize our identities, and sometimes leave us with the immensely satisfying feeling of being truly oneself with and in the eyes of a loved one. And because we not only love them, but also long for their reciprocated love, we also care what they think about us and how they view us. We can, along with having our identities partly constituted by how they see us, feel diminished and injured by their perceptions of us in ways that the perceptions and attitudes of others may neither partly constitute us nor matter to us at all. And importantly, we may not want our loved ones to view us in solely positive ways or with goodwill or respect. This is because, more fundamentally, we may want them to view us as beings who are lovable by them, mattering in just this relatively narrow sense. Return now to Morris's reflections on the pain of wronging a loved one, and thereby losing or threatening one's union or relationship with her. As Rorty writes, within such a relationship, it may become the case that, quote, the person regards certain traits as centrally defining his personality and believes he cannot retain those traits outside of the particular attentional relation. Thus, one's pain in such a circumstance may partly consist in the loss of the feeling of wholeness or completeness of one's identity. It may not then be simply painful, but involve the disorientation, anxiety, and disassociation that results from one's losing a sense of who one is. This kind of vulnerability is why acknowledging the perceptions and interpretations that others may have of us can come with an anxiety that may bear similarities to the anxieties we feel in acknowledging our biological deaths. We are not merely hurt, disappointed, or frustrated when they see us in certain ways rather than others, or when they do not attend to us at all. We may feel as though we are losing a centrally defining part of, and so sometimes entirely, ourselves. And while feeling fully oneself in the loving eyes of another can be deeply and intensely satisfying, one's desire for such attention can be fraught with ambivalence precisely because of the respects in which ourselves are relational. We may often be unwilling to allow those who love us to really see or attend to us, where part of our unwillingness is because we recognize both the credibility and the capacities they have in discovering and partly constituting who we are. It is why we may experience the love of others as both something we need, while also being a source of deep fear, while it may remain attractive, after all, to retreat to a conception of oneself that is more fortified and seemingly less relational. Having characterized the ways in which interpersonal love can render our identities vulnerable to others, and in particular how it is that they perceive us, we can now return to the question of how our love of others may give rise to the form of self-hatred I have in mind. In the proposed solutions to the problem of authority, we saw that a form of love for one's internalized figure may be necessary for rendering us susceptible to guilt. And for Freud, our love not only renders us susceptible to guilt, but thereby to self-hatred as well. But how does our love of others render us vulnerable to ourselves in the ways that I've described, and which I've suggested aren't best captured by thinking of the self-hating person as suffering from a guilty conscience? First, consider that love renders us susceptible to not only guilt, but remorse, which one gains a disposition to feel simply given the love of another person and given the possibility of being responsible for the damage or loss of the relationship that one shares with her. Unlike guilt, remorse need not be prompted by thoughts that one has violated a duty or obligation, nor does it necessitate that one perceives oneself as morally responsible for what has happened. But importantly, as with guilt, remorse will presuppose some form of responsibility, and so will implicate oneself, and thereby give rise to and sustain hostility redirected onto oneself as the party responsible for this damage or loss. The different sources of guilt and remorse account for differences in their phenomenology. On one standard Kantian conception of guilt, one feels both anger and anxiety as a species of fear at having violated an authoritative moral law. In feeling the worthy object of the anger of another, one may feel the pain of having taken something that one recognizes one does not deserve, or in occupying a status that it would be justifiable for someone to knock you down from. One may see in oneself a kind of self-conceit that calls for humbling, perhaps through the pain of deserved hard treatment. Remorse, in contrast, is best understood as a form of sorrow, rather than as a form of fear. In remorse, one's attention may be focused more directly on the loved object that has been lost. In the relevant kind of case here, the beloved, her love, or one's relationship with her. If the union with her has been lost in a way where she has also suffered, one may keep returning to images of her and her pain. John Day suggests, as a paradigmatic example of someone suffering from remorse, suggests that a paradigmatic example of someone suffering from remorse is Vronsky after the suicide of Anna Karenina. He contrasts this with the suffering of Raskolnikov, who feels the guilt of having committed murder without being concerned with the suffering and the loss of the particular pawnbroker he murders and whom he loathes. With Vronsky, we see a man tormented not by the thought that he has violated a moral duty or obligation, but rather tormented by images of the person he loved and whose suffering and ultimate death he perceives himself responsible for, although not morally responsible for. And given the role of our loved ones in maintaining our identities, one is again susceptible to not just the pains of separation from them, but to the disorientation and disassociation of no longer being oneself. To these extents, remorse is similar to another form of sorrow, grief. But unlike grief for a loved object that has been merely lost, remorse is felt when one perceives oneself as responsible for this loss. In remorse, the basic hostile responses that one would feel toward anyone who threatens or brings about the destruction of an object of one's love, one's relationship with the loved one, or the possibility of her love can be redirected onto oneself as the responsible party. Again, understanding responsibility here to encompass more than what one is morally responsible for. For example, consider the hostility and aggression that one might feel toward an actual other in jealousy. One perceives and feels that a rival has come to threaten an existing relationship of loving mutual attention with a loved one, and feels hostile in response to that rival, even if she has not done anything to encourage the attention of one's beloved, other than just being, for example, her lovely and charming self. One may nonetheless view the rival as responsible for threatening the relationship, even though one holds no insane moral expectation that the rival not be as lovely or charming as she is. Turning now back to oneself as the responsible party, perhaps the reason why one can no longer sustain a union with the beloved and her attention has nothing to do with what one has done, but with what one is like. Whatever qualities one perceives as explaining why the beloved's attention has been lost or threatened can become the basis of one's hostility toward oneself. Non-moral aspects of one's character, one's physicality or style, background, race, or class membership may become implicated in the explanation for the loss of this union, and so become the focus of one's hostility toward oneself. This is one reason why self-hatred can find its sources in such particular and idiosyncratic aspects of the self, and why one can experience it as resulting from concerns that are only indirectly one's own. I may come to hate myself for my lack of physical grace only once I imagine that it is what explains why I can no longer maintain my beloved's loving attention, just as I might hate a rival's beauty for being what I imagine does capture it instead. And this hostility is liable to intensify into hatred precisely in cases where what is threatened or lost is not only the relationship one has with the loved one, but also one's own identity insofar as that relationship was identity conferring. Given that the threat posed by another or oneself is experienced as a threat to who one is, one's hostile feelings may intensify to the point where they may, as they do with hatred of others, culminate in a desire to destroy or eliminate the hated object, now experienced as a kind of existential threat. Characteristics of remorse, when it develops into self-hatred, can also explain the self-hating person's willingness to accept and absorb hostility, whether that is his own hostility or the hostility of the loved one, and so why self-hatred is liable to perpetuation in this way. First, one's own suffering can take on a particular symbolic meaning in the context of the dissolution of a loving union, where one still has hope that the union might be restored. As Morris writes, the satisfaction that one obtains in self-inflicted or accepted pain here comes from the very conduct as painful, for it is this that evidences how much what we have done counts for one and how much it means for one to restore. Part of what it means to love another as well as oneself is not only pain felt when the loved object is hurt, but by pain one is prepared to face for the loved one. While the pain that one may seek in feeling guilty may symbolize how much one cares for one's moral relations to be restored with others, one's willingness to pay back one's debts, or an acceptance of humility, this will differ from the significance that Morris describes here, the pain that one is willing to undergo as proof of one's love. And another explanation becomes available in cases where one has lost hope that the love will be returned or the relationship restored. In remorse felt because I have lost the beloved's loving attention, I may become motivated to retain just the latter or what it is left in its wake. I may be willing to accept my perhaps entirely imagined and perhaps entirely exaggerated perception that she has of me. At least then I will be able to retain an existence in her eyes and thereby retain whatever aspect of my identity depended upon that relation. Thus, Pache Strawson, what we want from others cannot be limited to a desire that they have goodwill for us. Pache Murphy, one may not solely or most fundamentally care about the good opinion of another. When it comes to one's loved ones, what one may sometimes want is simply their attention, given its ability to provide one with a stable sense of one's identity, even if that identity is one that they also cannot admire, respect, or love. But importantly, self-hatred need not arise in the context of a failed relation to an actual other. Just as we don't need to be viewed by an actual other in a compromising way to feel shame, nor have our moral transgressions witnessed by an actual other in order to feel guilt, so we don't need to compromise a union with an actual other in order to feel self-hatred. Thus we must return to questions about the various ways in which we relate to the internalized other. We can also begin to see, as we see with the self-hatred of Rufus Scott, how this other may come to have the power to drown out the voices of actual others who may actually love us. There's a point here that will be of some help in characterizing who this internalized other is. In Williams's discussion of the role of the internalized other in the experience of shame, the internalized other is not reducible to an actual identifiable other, nor are they identical to just my own voice and perspective. According to Williams, she embodies and focuses a real set of values and concerns that I am vulnerable to, and in certain experiences of shame, I am vulnerable to her perspective of me, given that I also respect her and hope for her respect. This provides us with the resources, he argues, to show how genuinely ethical motivation can emerge from sources that may initially seem too immaturely heteronymous to be ethical in nature, driving us mistakenly, he thinks, toward the Kantian picture of the autonomous moral agent instead. As he puts this point, it is a mistake to suppose that there are only two options, that the other in ethical thought must be an identifiable individual or identifiable representative of the neighbors on the one hand, or else be nothing at all except an echo chamber for my solitary moral voice. The internalized other is indeed abstracted and generalized and idealized, but he is potentially somebody rather than nobody, and somebody other than me. He can provide the focus of real social expectations of how I shall act if I live, how I should live if I act in one way rather than another, of how my actions and reactions will alter my relations in the world about me. Now, keeping in mind just this point, that the internalized other can be understood as an abstracted, generalized, and idealized potential somebody who is at the very same time not an identifiable actual other, we can now characterize how one may come to view one's internalized other in a way that renders one susceptible to self-hatred. Consider that it is not just that I respect this internalized other or desire to become like her. Another way in which I may relate to her is that she is an internalized figure of the kind of love that I have described and whose reciprocated love and not just respect I seek. She is not, as Williams puts it, an identifiable actual other, but nor is she just me. And in the context of understanding self-hatred, what she provides is not solely a focus of real social expectations and concerns understood as a set of ethical or moral values. Rather, she also provides a focus of real expectations and concerns that determine whether or not a person is lovable by a hypothetical, idealized, generalized someone whose love I would seek. My own standards of the lovability of others will inform who this idealized and generalized person is, but it is her standards, or what I imagine them to be, that I am vulnerable to. But just as with ethical standards, both my standards and the standards that the internalized other embodies and focuses will be largely informed by the culture and society that I am raised in, and I need not grant these standards any kind of authority in order to be emotionally vulnerable to them. Again, one may want from this figure both identity conferring attention and love, and in happy cases, these do not diverge from one another. But now imagine a less happy case. I realize that I am in some way that compromises not just the internalized other's respect or admiration of me, but her love of me. I will feel the particular wound, the particular kind of worthiness and hopelessness that one feels in not just being unloved by a particular and actual loved person, but as unlovable by anyone whose love I would care or need to have reciprocated. And my self-directed hostility will fixate on whatever it is that I believe renders me unlovable. The idiosyncrasies of the qualities will depend on whatever standards of lovability have been embodied and focused by my internalized other. To illustrate these points, consider how Peccola Breedlove in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye comes to hate herself for her darkness, which in the eyes of actual others marks her as ugly. Given that the existing social standards of both the identity and lovability of girls and women heavily emphasize their physical appearance, she experiences her ugliness as both central to her identity and as explaining why she is unlovable. She fixates on what she believes will make her beautiful and thereby lovable by those whose love she seeks, quote, the blue eyes of a white girl. And this is not just the love of actual others. She also sees herself as unlovable in the eyes of an idealized, generalized, and abstracted other who, given that she is a child, is represented by her as an imaginary friend whose love and attention she longs for. And so here's just a conversation between her and her friend, her imaginary friend. But suppose my eyes aren't blue enough. Blue enough for what? Blue enough for, I don't know, blue enough for something, blue enough for you. I'm not gonna play with you anymore. Oh, don't leave me. Yes, I am. Why? Are you mad at me? Yes. Because my eyes aren't blue enough? Because I don't have the bluest eyes? No, because you're acting silly. Don't go, don't leave me. Will you come back if I get them? Get what? The bluest eyes. Will you come back then? In my hopes to nonetheless achieve some sense that I am lovable by this internalized other, I may focus my energies on attempting to become so, sometimes with self-defeating and devastating results, given that these standards will encompass much that a person simply cannot change about themselves, because they are often conceptually inconsistent or otherwise practically impossible to meet, or because they conflict with what would make for a good human life. One will be drawing from, after all, the imperfect materials of the social world that one is in, including the content of the fantasies of that world. This is a familiar way in which self-hatred will manifest itself. But we may also imagine someone who has lost hope. I simply cannot become the kind of person who, in the eyes of my internalized other, is capable of being loved. Perhaps all I can do is inspire her contempt or her disgust. I may nonetheless strive for identity conferring attention, given that it holds the promise of maintaining a sense of my identity in both in relation to her and in her eyes. Given this need, I may become willing to bear and absorb the unlovable self-conception that I imagine she has of me, at least someone contemptible or disgusting to her, rather than no one, at least in relation to her at all. Of course, given that this identity is also one that one also hates, it is what one believes has rendered one unlovable after all, this particular manifestation of self-hatred is liable to become unbearable. Adhering to one's identity will not entail an adherence to life. Return finally to the self-hatred of Rufus Scott. Among other aspects of himself, Rufus's Blackness has become a source of his self-hatred. And interestingly, it was his love for Leona which introduced in him a new kind of vulnerability that he had not until then experienced. In imagining now how he is seen as a lover of a white woman, abstracted and idealized, his Blackness gains a new kind of significance for him. It has rendered him in her eyes, and thereby in his eyes, unlovable. Spelled out the resources that have been brought to bear, we can now see that his self-hatred persists partly because he cannot escape the eyes of this imagined, idealized, and abstracted, internalized other, whose love he longs for, but who he perceives cannot really love him given his Blackness. The gestures and expressions of the actual Leona, who insists that she does love him, whatever they are intended to be, are now interpreted by Rufus through this lens, one partly constructed by his imagined self-conception in the eyes of this internalized other. Concretely, it is not love that he then experiences her as expressing, but rather a mix of condescension and sexual fetish. As Vivaldo tries to convince Rufus that Leona does in fact love him, Rufus replies, quote, "She loves the colored folks so much, sometimes I just can't stand it. You know all that chick knows about me, the only thing she knows?" He put his hand on his sex brutally, as though he would tear it out, and seemed pleased to see Vivaldo wince. Rufus is trapped by this self-conception, by his need to be both loved and seen by this internalized other in particular, and by his conviction that the person he is being seen as from that perspective cannot also be one that is loved. Neither, however, is he able to continue living as the unlovable object of his own hatred. Tortured, Rufus walks onto the George Washington Bridge. He stood at the center of the bridge, and it was freezing cold. He raised his eyes to heaven. He thought, "You bastard, you motherfucking bastard. Ain't I your baby too?" He began to cry. Something in Rufus which could not break shook him like a rag doll and splashed salt water all over his face and filled his throat and his nostrils with anguish. He knew the pain would never stop. He could never go down into the city again. He dropped his head as though someone had struck him and looked down at the water. It was cold and the water would be cold. He was black and the water was black. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, Vida. We're going to stop recording now. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we will come back and begin our Q&A.
Thank you.